Inside the last 23 minutes of the SportsMax Zone. Now, on this Monday over the last week, the world has been celebrating the career of Serena Williams. The 40-year-old American played what is thought to be her final professional match on Friday, losing in the third round of the US Open to the Australian Ayla Tomljanovic. Williams going down 5-7, 7-6, 6-1. Serena has finished her career with 23 major titles, the most by any player in the Open era, and despite falling one short of the all-time mark of 24 held by the Australian Margaret Court, Williams is widely considered the greatest female ever to play the game. But Court might not be in agreement with that pronouncement. First off, the 80-year-old has blasted Serena for her post-match interview after defeat to Tomljanovic. And here's what Margaret Court said. I thought it was bad that Williams didn't mention her opponent more when she spoke. We were taught to be role models for the young in how we behaved. We were taught to honor our opponent. You learn from your losses. We respected one another. Serena has played 7 years more than I did. I finished in my early 30s. People forget that I took 2 years out. I first retired when I was 25, thinking I would never return to tennis. I got married, had a baby, but then had one of my best years, winning 24 of 25 tournaments. I came back after 2 babies. After the first baby, I won 3 out of the 4 slams. Serena hasn't won a slam since having a baby. Meanwhile, Serena hasn't shut the door on whether she could decide against retirement. Following Friday's match in New York, she was asked what it would take for her to play professionally again.
Oh, I'm not thinking about that. I always did love Australia, though, but yeah, you know what? I think I've come a long way since last year at Wimbledon, just not sure if that was my last moment or not. And making it a different moment, I think, is much better. Yeah, and it takes a lot of work to get here. Clearly, I'm still capable, but it takes a lot more than that. I'm ready to be a mom and explore a different version of Serena. And technically, in the world, I'm still super young, so I want to have a little bit of a life while I'm still walking.
Okay, so before we get to the Margaret Court pronouncements, your take, George and Mariah, on Serena Williams' narrative just now, because she does seem, even on court with the interview, that she is leaving the door open for a return to the courts.
I think she isn't sure herself. I think she wants to give herself the opportunity, and she keeps speaking about, being there for her child, and of course living a life free of having to worry without any sort of pressure on her. So I get the sense, team, that she's just letting it, as we say, swing how it swings. So if she steps away and she feels as if she has the energy, she misses tennis and she wants to return, she's leaving that door open. And notice, we spoke about this on Friday, her choice of words. She has never said to anyone that she's retiring. She just keeps stressing the fact that there's more to life than just tennis.
And George, you heard her just now. She did admit to liking Australia, which is the next Grand Slam in January.
Yeah. Friday when we discussed it, and I said leaving the door ajar meant that she could, get a wild card. I mean, she
goes on to win the US Open, which would represent good form line for Serena. Would this in some way make people feel that, Serena does probably have enough left to win one more Grand Slam?
Well, I see where you're going. The tennis form lines don't hold up like that, though.
Yeah.
It's not like a boxing match then, where you knock this guy out. So if you fight the guy you knocked out, then logically you'd be expected to knock that guy out.
It doesn't work much in boxing either, anyway.
And there you go. But it's worse in tennis.
Yes,
but I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
No, because again, how much do you dedicate to the process? Who are you? What are you? Are you a popular player who has a couple Grand Slam titles under her belt? No. You are, arguably, people say, the greatest of all time.
Yes.
You have a process by which you prepare yourself for Grand Slams. You, at your advanced age in tennis, have to prepare a peculiar kind of way. Your preparation has to be thorough, it has to be detailed, it has to be deliberate.
Yes.
She doesn't have the time now in this phase of her life to devote to that, because that's what she's evolving away from.
Right,
So
and
it would be inimical for her to go back to that when her narrative is that I'm trying to leave that part of my life behind.
And she wants to focus on other things. How can you play a tennis match and focus on other things? I think we have...
All right, we're joined by Chris Taylor, our tennis analyst. He's a tennis coach along with many other things, Chris. We've already discussed what happened with Serena on Friday evening. Can we move swiftly, if you want to make a very, very quick comment on her game on Friday? Margaret Court's pronouncement pretty much bashing Serena on several levels and suggesting that Serena has a much easier time now than Margaret Court, had when she played and she was a Grand Slam winner more than 50 years ago.
Yeah, it sounds like a competition for the greatest of all time. It sounded a bit petty from Margaret Court, who has had her own issues, her own controversies throughout her career, as you can quite remember. It's been well quoted throughout her Australian history, many things that she has stood up against and been controversial. I do agree with her that I think Serena could have given more credit to her opponent, and that's something that if you're going to find something to blemish the career of Serena Williams, is that she could have been more graceful throughout her career. She has had many incidents that have popped up over time, which are things that she would probably like to forget, and that has gone against her. But in terms of her legacy, in terms of what she's accomplished on the court, in doubles, singles, and everything else, I think it's only a 3-horse race. It's between herself, Margaret Court, and Steffi Graf in terms of who would be the greatest female player of all time. But yeah, Margaret Court still at the top of the list. And I mean, if you even want to combine the doubles titles as well, nobody can compare to Margaret Court in terms of, what she has won or how many titles she has won. But yeah, I do think that Serena could have given more credit to Tomljanovic in terms of her performance. But it came down to what we spoke about earlier in the week, the fact that playing these 7 matches where she couldn't even make it past the third one does take a toll on the body. And you could see in that third set that Serena was very tired and wavering. So I agree with George that I don't think that she's dedicated to the preparation necessary for her to lift that 24th title. And I think that's the biggest deal for Serena. She doesn't put in the work. She hasn't put in the work in the same way that she did, which carried her to those 23 Grand Slams. And I think that's the biggest deal now. And now that she's older, it's much harder to get back to that level.
Yeah. Well, Chris, if we talk about the discussion, the GOAT, and the fact that the last Grand Slam title Margaret Court would have been like 50 years ago, isn't it that people talking about tennis today wouldn't even have seen Margaret Court play to be in an authoritative position to compare the two?
Maybe not. Well, you would have quite a few tennis historians who are still alive who would have been lucky enough to see Margaret Court and see Serena and Steffi Graf as well. Obviously, Margaret Court came in the pre-Open era as well as in the Open era, and in both eras, her statistics were phenomenal. I mean, she had like a 90% win record. I mean, that is
about 94 to put it higher, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it was unbelievable in terms of what she achieved, Margaret Court. What I will say, and what goes for Serena, is that as a black woman in this world and the adversities that she would have faced in her career, the fact that she's gotten to where she's got, I think, is a big deal. That is something that goes for her in terms of the conversation. I think life and general things were a lot easier for Margaret Court as an Australian. So that is the aspect of it that I think goes in Serena's favor. But if we're talking strict statistics, I think Margaret Court would be ahead of her in terms of what she accomplished in doubles, mixed doubles, singles, the amount of consecutive titles, XYZ.
Yeah, and Chris, the fact of the matter is it's an unpopular opinion that you are expressing. It's the same opinion I have, that if you are to just count strict medals and accomplishments in terms of what you won, for me, Court is still ahead. But in terms of influence and inspiration and impact on the modern game, I mean, Serena is unparalleled. When though, Chris, did the tennis GOAT argument, much like the golf GOAT argument, become about who won the most titles? Because if you notice very well from golf, they say, oh, Tiger is this because Tiger is now has what, 15 in his belt. Jack has 18, and people are trying to carry the argument there. And for Serena, it is only because, I mean, if she had 20, I know people would be making as strong a case as they are, but she has 23, almost 24. When did these two sports, especially tennis that we're talking about now, and Serena and Margaret Court, become determined the GOAT based on who has won the most titles? Is that all there is to it?
No, and we've spoken about this in many different sports, George. You think about football and cricket. It has to be your impact on the sport, your impact on the world itself. And I will agree with you that I think Serena, if you really look at that, has had a bigger impact on the world. Maybe it's because of her ethnicity, but it's also how she has, as I said, just her presence, her power, her personality on court. I think has had a bigger impact than Margaret Court for sure. If you look at even how fashion has changed in tennis, the Williams sisters have had a big deal to do with that. Just rackets. I mean the sales from a Wilson and Nike perspective. If you even want to look at how people play tennis and so on, you know, what generates people. I mean, how media rights have blown out of this world. I mean, Margaret Court certainly didn't have that kind of impact like Serena.
Chris,
so that's why previously I was saying if you're looking at the overall package, Serena is probably has affected the sport the most.
Here's the nuclear question though, Chris. Does it matter if Serena is the GOAT or not? When you look at the woman's accomplishment, what she has done, and for the influence in all the areas that you have just mentioned. Does it matter if any group of analysts, if any colony, if any constituency, if any group, any committee says you are the GOAT, then you are the GOAT? Does it matter? Hasn't Serena's accomplishments been so outsized that her influence and her place in sport, not just tennis, is undisputed, and we should appreciate that rather than quibble about whether or not she's the GOAT in her sport?
Well, I guess it matters to our fellow journalists and analysts. It gives us something to do, eh? But I think from a Serena perspective, I don't think it's either here or there. She will know what she has accomplished. I mean, obviously, Margaret Court is quite taken aback that Serena could be considered the GOAT. So she jumped in. I thought that, you know, yeah, that was that maybe that was a bit of that was an area of a lack of class from Court's perspective. But I don't think it's a big deal for Serena whether she ends up being the GOAT or not. But obviously, for the historians, the journalists, the media entities, it makes an interesting conversation and one that we can carry on for a long time. But yeah, what she has done for the world of sport and the world of tennis and for women across the world, I think is a big deal. And for the most part, Serena has been something to admire with the few blemishes in between.
Right, and Chris, an article published today by The Guardian saying that Margaret Court says Serena Williams played in a much easier era and she would have loved to play now because, you know, Serena has the opportunity to have coaches and psychologists and things that she would not have gotten in her time.
A lot of people like to say that their era was a more difficult era than the current one and so on. The truth is, you can only play in the era that you're born into. And the fact is, in Margaret Court's time, people didn't have video analysis to scrutinize your game. So Serena's opponents would have been able to sit down and look at all of Serena's game and dissect it and say, okay, this is where we're going to attack Serena, this is her weakness and so on. And they had all of that at their mercy. And she still won 23 Grand Slams, and it could have been a lot more. So that doesn't necessarily go in Margaret Court's favor. In her time, people didn't have the kind of footage to analyze her game and so on. It was only when they were playing against her that they could try and work things out. So there's always different areas in each era that you could say is easier or worse or better than. The fact is, in her era, she was the best Serena. And so was Court in her era.
Yeah.
And I would just rather to leave it at that.
Yeah, well, let's leave it there as well, Chris. Great talking to you on this discussion with Margaret Court and her pronouncements today. Of course, Margaret Court, not a very popular person, even in her own Australia, where she has spoken out against gay rights and same-sex marriages and so on. And in today's world, that is a platform that you get a lot of condemnation for. But thanks, Chris. And we'll be back with more on the SportsMax Zone after this.